Hey y'all, welcome back. It's me, Mama King, and I'm back for another reading of The Great Cosmic Mother. All right, rediscovering the religion of the earth. All right, today's chapter is entitled The Witch Hunts. I prayed before I opened up to this one, okay? I have not read it yet, so this will be my first time as I read it to you. This will be the first time that I'm hearing it. I haven't, particularly that I know of, heard of anyone else reading it yet. So this particular chapter begins on page 298 and it ends on page 314. So let's begin, okay? If life is inherently evil, the church fathers needed someone to blame. And who is better to blame than woman who creates life from her own body? Living women also can be publicly punished as the iconic and illusory devil can never be. The myth of feminine evil, which has dominated the Western world for over 2,000 years, led logically and directly to the religiously targeted murder of women as witches during the Great Inquisition of Europe. Until recently, the number of deaths from the Inquisition was euphemistically underestimated as a way of denying about 500 years of systemic persecution and slaughter by the Holy Christian Church. Now, perhaps deaths are overestimated. We don't know. The estimates range from 1 million to 9 million people burned as witches between the 15th and 18th century. Between 1200 and 1484, people were officially killed as heretics. One number is certain of people punished for witchcraft in Europe. 80% of those accused, tortured, and burnt were women. Town records from Germany and France reveal that whole villages were emptied of their female populations during the peak of the fire frenzy, including very young girls and very elderly women. Travelers of the time reported countrysides hideously littered with stakes and pyres. And pyres, P-I-R-E-S, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Of course, forgiveness is essential. Oh, good point. Large numbers of homosexual men were also tortured and burnt at the stake. In fact, this is the origin of the term, and it's in parentheses, faggot, to denote a male homosexual. And I mean no disrespect, and I do not use that term. Okay, homosexual men were bound together at the foot of witch pyres, their bodies used as faggots to kindle the flames. Okay, in Europe at first, Christianity was a religion of the elite. It was an affectation. It was an affectation. I'm Affectation. I gotta look that up. Hold on.
Affectation.
A noun, a mannerism or habit that is assumed rather than natural, especially to impress others. A behavior characterized by such mannerisms or habits artificially. A simpering manner that was mere affectation. It is an attempt to assume or exhibit what is not natural or real. False display, artificial show. All right. Yeah. Okay. So it was like in Europe at first, Christianity was a religion of the elite. It was an affectation of feudal lords and later kings who made Latin the official court as well as church language, and who kept Christian priests around as house clerics. The large masses of people remained as they were, pagan, i.e. peasants on the land, practicing the ancient agricultural goddess rites. Unexpectedly for the Roman Church, however, its 3 centuries of crusades to the Holy Lands had an ideological side effect. Returning feudal lords brought back exotic religious and lifestyle ideas, including the tantric sexual arts from the lands of the infidels. Of course, i.e., Islam with strong Moorish pagan undertones. The European elite, normally Christians, especially those in the most civilized parts of Europe, which were southern France, the wealthy cities of central France, Italy, Belgium, and the Rhinelands, were abandoning the fad of Christianity for more sensual and joyful spiritual amusements, including communal sex and bisexuality, not to mention Goliard and troubadour, poetry, and romantic lute music. Lute from Arabic alud, the wood, which was often composed and sung by wandering ex-monks in the celebration of wine, women, and song. Sounds like a party. So their lyrics often mocked the church by turning hymns to the Virgin into erotic love songs to Venus, and portrayed Christian clerics as drunken bums. Really? No disrespect to anyone's religion, okay? So the Roman Catholic Church was uneasy in Europe at this time, being constantly accused of priestly corruption, luxuriousness, and political religious chicanery. Europeans were backsliding into their indigenous paganism. Gnostic beliefs were circulating sub rosa, and communities of medieval hippies were springing up everywhere. The threatened church could not tolerate the mass apostasy of its rich southern feudal elites. Engaging in shady political deals with some northern feudal lords, it arranged for the massacres of the Knights of Templar and other sexual mystical communes of southern France. Thus, circa 1200 was the Inquisition invented. The church claimed it was punishing heretics. In fact, in these first slaughters of the playful and poetic southern French aristocracy, I know that word, aristocracy, the Roman Church was declaring its political intention to stay in power in Europe by any means necessary, including the murder of anyone who questioned its power or simply adopted a lifestyle of which it did not politically approve. Originally, the church had no punishments for witchcraft. In fact, it was considered heresy to believe in the possibility of bewitchment. People were simply condemned for the delusions of flying, enchantment, and the like. But in the mid-15th century, Roman Catholic dominated Europe was in hideous turmoil once again. It had undergone the Black Plague, the 100 Years' War, and so many other physical manifestations of its spiritual morbidity under Christianity. Nations were beginning to mark borders and gather secular power under kings vis-a-vis the universal power of the Roman Pope and his archbishops throughout Europe. The church had already established a pattern of acclimating and tightening its secular power by way of religious purges, heretic hunting. By this means, it terrorized and eliminated its political ideological enemies, and at the same time diverted or co-opted the seething sexual revolutionary energies of the masses of people. In 1484, therefore, Pope Innocent VIII pronounced a papal bull against the now suddenly discovered crime of witchcraft. He denounced witchcraft as an organized conspiracy of the devil's army against the peace and common order of the Holy Christian Empire, a peace and common order which people living under that empire had rarely experienced. And thus the war against women was officially launched by the Christian papacy as a divisionary tactic to keep itself in power through the strategy of sheer terror. 2 years later, in 1486, two Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer with an E, published a book called Malleus Maleficarium, Hexenhammer, the Hammer of Witches. This book, in which femina is derived from the Latin feminius, fee, minus, lacking in faith, was the official handbook of the witch hunters, who found it priestly and psychological. Find it in priestly and psychological justification for their already religiously aggravated hatred and fear of women. It became the indispensable authority for the Inquisition during the next 300 years of mass terror and persecution throughout Europe. The hammer stated that human females were by nature agents and tools of the devil, and it gave explicit instructions for recognizing signs of devil possession. Any wart, mole, or freckle, or other skin blemish was a sign that a woman had been kissed by Satan, and was evidence enough to send her to the stake. Behavior also was stigmatic. The way a woman or young girl dressed, the way she walked or talked, her hairstyle, the way she moved her eyes, any suspicious or envy that she might arouse in neighbors, any uniqueness, creativity, authority, or stubbornness of mind she might display for any reason whatsoever, all was a signature of the devil in her flesh. For wasn't woman born, in God's own words, to entertain Satan in her private parts, and thus to endanger the souls of men? In Kramer's and Springer's professional opinions, only the rarest of females and dead ones were proof against demonic seduction and inhabitation. Thus was tumultuous Europe given a reason for all its woes. Okay, so here we go. Cherchez la femme and burn her, the Malleus Maleficarum, inflamed the paranoia and hatred of the male mind against female flesh and mental autonomy, and in the hands of the local priest, preacher, and judge, sanctified the arrest, torture, and burning of any woman who was denounced. Millions of European women, among them the best and bravest minds of their day, for these were days of cowards and fools, the only type who survived in large numbers. The Christian witch burners were obsessed with sex, and the witch hammer constantly equates the devil with sexual activity. The power of the devil lies in the privy parts of men. It was also believed that all material life sprang from semen, bodily speaking. Sons and less valued daughters were owned by the father, as much a part of the master's property as were servants and animals. Women, with their devil-inspired power over sex, were thus a major threat to a man's possessions, not only his soul, but all other worldly goods. Witches were accused of instigating extramarital sex, of inhibiting potency, hindering conception, slaying infants in the womb, all threats to patrilineal, all threats to patrilineal property inheritance. For every impotent man, a woman could be tortured and burned. Whoa. Within the grim Inquisition torture chambers also, prurience and piety were two joined hands. Women were raped and sexually abused by their official torturers as they lay chained to dungeon walls or spread out naked on the racks, all with the blessings of the priests, who readily rationalized these activities as devil exorcism. The torture instruments were blessed by the priests before they were used. Kramer and Springer, the two Dominican monks who wrote The Hammer, were eventually chastised by the Catholic Church for their habit of going around to German villages and fabricating evidence of witchery. For example, Kramer paid an old drunk woman to hide in ovens and make weird noises, plus, are thus proving to her neighbors that the woman of the house was possessed. But of course, this chastisement was not severe. Even if evidence against the woman was fabricated, she probably was a witch or could be one someday. An ounce of prevention, and so many women had already been burned or would be burned. There was no way to stop it. Originally plotted and engineered by the Catholic Church, the European witch burners took on the atmosphere of a natural holocaust, spiritual fires set by God, burning out the evil plagues of the human soul. Witchcraft was unavoidably political. It was what remained of the native pagan European religion, kept alive through 1,000 years of Roman Church imperialism and imported Christian ideology. Witchcraft was the religion of the country people and served as a tribal core around which potential and actual revolt could be mounted. King Richard I was a witch. He dreamed of leading a pagan uprising against European Christian courts and churches, but the Crusades drained off resources and energy from his plans. Too many feudal lords chose to go off to fight in the Palestinian Holy Lands. Rather than remain at home fighting for their own pagan lands, the holy soil of the old religion. Witchcraft was why the church allowed Joan of Arc to be burned. She could not only lead France against its secular enemies, she might also lead the people against the oppressive dominance of the French church crown. For Jeanne d'Arc was a native European witch, resonating to the needs and dreams of the peasantry. In the wrestling match for power between the Catholic Church and the New Reformation, the Protestant sects, witches were made scapegoats by both sides. In German Catholic villages and towns, priests directed the people to burn Protestants and witches. In German Protestant towns and villages, preachers called for the burning of Catholics and witches. In these endless sectarian games, which make up so much of European history, people's conditioned biophobias, the endless paranoias and hatreds produced by dogmatic repression, were systemically directed by the Christian Church against witches, women, and other scapegoats, and thus diverted from rebellion against what was truly oppressing them: the unearned wealth, power, and corruption of the Christian Church itself. Martin Luther had been ballyhooed as a freedom-loving reformer. In fact, he was the same tyrant in stubbornly unpriestly garb. All the reformist men were fanatic haters of witchcraft. Shouted Luther, "I would have no compassion on the witches. I would burn them all." Martin Luther raged against the peasant rebellions that were breaking out everywhere, because the peasants were pagans. Luther believed the revolts were instigated and led by witches and Satan. He saw clearly that these indigenous uprisings threatened the imperialist Christian church crown control of Europe, which he fully supported. He called for the merciless slaughter of all the rebellious peasants in God's name. 5 centuries of Holy Inquisition, especially the intensive 300 years of witch hunts following the papal bull of 1484, were a means of increasing the real wealth as well as power of the Christian Church. The property of every person burned passed into the church's possessions: lands, goods, money, and it wasn't just the poor who were burned. On the contrary, the Inquisition was finally ended because more and more whole towns were being ravaged and depopulated, with leading citizens arrested and brought to the stake. Thousands upon thousands of acres of land, homes, farms, and businesses, personal wealth and goods, all were stripped from the accused witch and absorbed into the church. Children of the condemned were forced to stand before the stakes, watching their parents burn. As they watched, they were whipped by the priest as punishment for being spawn of the devil. These children, orphaned and robbed of all inheritance except shame and grief, were sent to wander as beggars or imprisoned in church or in Christian orphanages. Orphanages. We can wonder how many of us are descendants of these church disinherited orphans. That's what I was thinking as I'm reading this, who numbered in the millions. Okay, this didn't all happen so long ago. Witches were still being burned daily in 17th century Europe. The Inquisition gave itself license to use any means to force confessions out of the accused. Judicial torture, not allowed under native European law, was imported directly from old Roman law for the express purpose of extracting confessions from witches. The proving of a devil possession was cunning, for the refusal to confess companionship with Satan was seen as a sure sign of guilt, which confession was heard as clear admission of guilt. A wild confession was heard as clear admission of guilt, though most confessions were extracted only by the most hideous torture. Both denial and confession were punished with death. In some trials, witches were bound hand and foot and thrown into deep ponds. If they drowned, they were pronounced innocent. If they managed to float, they were hauled out, pronounced guilty, and dragged to the stake. Professional men called prickers made a living going from town to town, striking needles or sticking needles into women. Accused women were exposed naked from the waist down in the public square for this purpose. The prick was a tool with a hollow shaft, allowing the pricker to appear to stick a woman's flesh. Oh my God. If she didn't bleed from the wound, she was a witch. Of course, with this secret retractable needle, the pricker could guarantee that many women did not bleed. And for each witch he thus exposed to death, he was paid money by the local church and town government. That sounds like the same thing that goes along today. Okay, pricking the women. Oh, Lord. Okay, so many male professionals profited from the witch trials and executions. Listen, local judges, bailiffs, guards, and doctors all got their cut, as well as the torturer and the scaffold maker. In some cases, the accused witch was actually charged for the cost of searching her or his house, transportation to the trial, the cost of the paper used to record the trial, all food eaten during imprisonment, the cost of the wood consumed during the burning, and the travel expenses for two judges to escort the burnt body to a gravesite. Have mercy. The witch trial transcripts are hideous but sobering reading. From such transcripts and for freedom gleaned the story of Frau Peller. It seems a notable German judge, Franz Berman, lusted after Frau Peller's sister. The sister refused to sleep with him. In retaliation, Frau Peller was arrested. She was arrested in the morning, and by 2 p.m. she was tortured. She was exorcised, shaved, searched, and raped by the torturer's assistant, and further tortured. To silence her cries, Judge Berman himself stuffed a dirty handkerchief into her mouth. After being tortured into naming her accomplices in witchcraft, Frau F-R-A-U, Frau Peller was indeed convicted and burned alive in a hut of dry straw. Her husband, a court assessor, protested her trial and was thrown out of the courtroom. He died a few months later. Judge Berman was a busy man. In 2 visits to 3 small German villages near Bonn in 1631 and in 1636, he managed to burn alive 150 people from a total of 300 households. That's half the population. Some of the simpler torture instruments used were eye gougers, branding irons, metal forehead tourniquets, and spine rollers with sharp metal protrusions. There were the usual thumb screws and leg vices, stocks with iron spikes, and boards with sharp pegs on which people were forced to kneel for hours. One of the most exotic instruments were called the pear. It was roughly the size and shape of a pear, constructed in two metallic halves, each attached to a handle and hinged to open, like scissors or forceps. The pear was heated to red hot, then inserted in the prisoner's mouth, anus, and or vagina, and spread open as far as it would go. One renowned trial judge in France, Jean Baudin, boasted of torturing very young children and invalids. Oh my goodness. A lawyer, a philosopher, and demonologist, considered one of the best minds of his generation, Baudin specialized in cauterize and hot irons, and then cutting out of the putrefied flesh. Feathers were dipped in burning sulfur and clamped in armpits and groins. People were given scalding baths in water mixed with lime, and bodies were stretched on racks and ladders, or suspended by the thumbs with weights attached to the ankles. In the strappado, considered a mild torture, the arms were tied behind the back with a rope attached to a pulley. The body was hoisted up and weights were attached to the feet. In squashation, a more severe punishment, this trussed body was suddenly allowed to drop several feet, then jerked up, then dropped again. You mean like a bungee cord? Ooh, maybe. Okay, nothing. The point frequently achieved was to separate all the joints in the body, even after people had confessed, been sentenced, and were waiting to be burned. They could still be subjected to random torture. Hands, tongues, noses, and ears were cut off, and women's breasts were torn with red-hot pincers. Girls as young as 9 or 10 were persuaded through such tortures to confess they had sexual relations with the devil. In the American colonies, where an estimated 300 people were killed as witches, some burnt, most were hung. Torture was also used against young and old. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, 2 young boys were tied up from the neck and heels until blood dripped from their noses. Then they confessed, accusing their mother, who was hung. Some of these activities took place in dungeons to the private titillation of torturers, judges, and priests. Other tortures occurred in public with much pious fulmination, supposedly to edify, terrify, and entertain the general populace. And of course, the design, manufacture, and sale of torture devices was a big business, especially in Germany, but also in France and Spain, where the Inquisition was at its worst and the longest. So all this hideous activity, we must remember, took place in the name of Christ and by the will of God, and was said to be aimed solely at the discipline and salvation of the human soul. The Exodus 22:18 injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," was frequently quoted, though in 1584 an Englishman, Reginald Scott, pointed out that the Hebrew word for poisoner has been mistranslated as a witch. But pagan witches, as specialists in herbal medicine and hallucinogens, were easy to slander as poisoners in Old Testament Hebrew as well as medieval European times. The words could have been used interchangeably. There are numerous biblical texts expressing Yahweh's hatred and condemnation of all people who could be generically, and I'm not changing it, who can be generically defined as witches, diviners, pythons, conjurers, fortune tellers. We know that all Neolithic goddess worshipping peoples were identified by the Hebrew prophets and patriarchs as evil, idolatrous, and unclean, and Yahweh wanted them all dead. Christianity's remarkably ugly record of religious intolerance begins in the Old Testament, where Yahweh's people are directed by him to murder anyone practicing a rival religion. The 500 years of European Inquisition and witch burnings had their direct inspiration and sanctification from the Holy Bible, and there is no way to avoid this conclusion. The secular motives, the secular gains of the witch hunts can be credited to the imperialism of the Roman Catholic Church, to the equally power-hungry fanaticism of the Protestant reformists, and to all the other European men who obtained advantage of sick thrills from the torture and destruction of the human body in general, and women's bodies in particular. The Christian Church used the Bible's divine mandate for religious murder not only to survive the political turmoil of the Middle Ages, but to expand and secure one of the largest and most powerful secular institutions on the earth, Western Christendom. Okay, so we have been persuaded to believe by Christian apologists that the church only meant to execute the bad witches, people who cursed and poisoned their fellow beings. This is a lie. The Christian church during the Inquisition did make a distinction between the good witch and the bad witch, and it ordered that both kinds be destroyed. Theologians of the day wrote that the good witch was a more horrible and a detestable monster than the wicked one. The church claimed the good witches were even more harmful to its authority than the magnificent ones. Civil law did not call for the punishment of the white witch or unbinding witch, as the helpful witches were called. But ecclesiastical law did. Why? Because the good witch more effectively persuaded her neighbors of the genuine power of her religion. She successfully undermined God's will that humans should suffer. Her cures worked. For 1,000 years, the women had one healer and one only, the sorceress. Emperors and kings and popes and the richest barons had sundry doctors of Salerno, Salerno, or Moorish and Jewish physicians. But the main body of every state, the whole world, we may say, consulted no one but the Saga, the wise woman. The priest realizes clearly where the danger lies, that an enemy, a menacing rival, is to be feared in this high priestess of nature he pretends to despise. And the Dominican Springer, he of the hammer, wrote, "We should speak of the heresy of the sorceresses, not of the sorcerers. The latter are of small account. Nature makes them sorceresses." A French writer under Louis XIII wrote, "For one sorcerer, 10,000 sorceresses." The sorceress, the town witch, was also and always the people's healer, the midwife, the skilled pharmacologist. The people needed her. Women especially needed her. Christian authorities admitted that the good witch's help to the country people was of ancient tradition and good effect, but this was a cause for burning them. The white witch's power to cure sickness proved that she had a pact with the devil. The priests could not cure. They had only punitive dogmas, abstract words, empty gestures, typical of rootless ritual. If the good witch could cure, clearly she possessed superior knowledge and power, a possibility the church could not allow. Instead, it officially sourced her power in evil. The white and the black witch were both guilty alike in compounding with the devil. Thus, with one stroke, the priestly hierarchies eliminated both their rivals for public influence and the living evidence that their own religion was a fraud. As the witch hammer spelled it out, any unexplained power or phenomenon was suspicious. Sourced in evil, in 15th century Europe was a hotbed of unexplained phenomena. There were rationalists extant. There were rationalists extant who scoffed at the notion of witchery, arguing that strange occurrences could be the result of a simple manipulation of hidden but natural powers, not necessarily demonic ones. Okay? But all power, however human or natural, threatened the total authority of the church fathers and the real powers of witches, powers of nature and the human psyche, knowledge, customs, and techniques going back for millennia were the greatest threats of all, for these were precisely the traditions the patriarchy had broken with. The Malleus Maleficarum let me let someone else say it. Okay, here we go.
Malleus Maleficarum.
Yep, that's what I'm saying. Okay. Okay, so Malleus Maleficarum. Now I lost my place. Give me a second. So the Malleus Maleficarum called for the destruction of the ancient and secret knowledge of poisons or herbs and drugs, healing and hurtful, a tradition of lore which had been handed down from the remotest time. Healing and hurtful, it was not the witch's wickedness, but her effectiveness that the church wanted to destroy. I understand completely. So in patriarchal religion, only God has power. Power does not exist in nature, and it is not something he shares with his creatures. Dreams, faith, and energy must be strictly directed and controlled by his church, his police force on earth. And no one may fly through the night with the moon, or envision other worlds, or commune with the earth and the stars, or cure illness with herbs without being seen as the agent of the devil. The monks Kramer and Springer prove that any form of knowledge which is not a direct revelation of God the Father is of the devil, and only priest had direct revelation of God. An ordinary mortal claiming such experience was clearly possessed by Satan. So the people's ancient knowledge was, of its very nature, suspect and sinful. The miracles performed by Christian saints were given them by the grace of God, not by the power of nature. In Christianity, nature has neither grace nor power. If it appears to exhibit either, the appearance must be devilish. The saints' miracles were evidence of only anti-natural power, belonging to those who deny nature and give themselves to the Father. The kind of power exhibited by the saint who stood before a crowd of peasants and slowly, one by one, plucked all the feathers out of the body of a wild bird. He then handed around the bloody, tortured mass as evidence that nature could not save her creatures. Only God had willed their destruction at the hands of a holy man. Since we are born of God, what wonder then that the sons of God enjoy extraordinary powers? The daughters of the goddess, on the other hand, were burned alive by the millions for exhibiting and using their own extraordinary powers. And when we see that witch knowledge was identical with agricultural knowledge, with earth, moon, and star lore, then it is no wonder that the peasants' rebellions were tied in with the witch hunts. Neither shall ye use enchantment nor observe times, Leviticus 19:26. Idolatry is the first of all superstitions. Divination is the second, and the observing of times and seasons the third. And that's from Malleus Maleficarum, Part 1, Question 2. Seemingly demons are readier to appear when summoned by magicians under the influence of certain stars. They do this in order to deceive men, thus making them suppose that the stars have some divine power or actual divinity. And we know that in days of old, this veneration of the stars led to the vilest idolatry. And that's also from Malleus Maleficarum, Part 1, Question 6. And there are 3 superstitions: necromancy, geomancy, and hydromancy, also from Malleus Maleficarum, Part 1, Question 2. Three superstitions: the study of death, earth, and water, plus the study of the stars. St. Augustine opposed cyclic theories of the moon, and Christian men could proclaim, as they did, the sun and moon were made for us. How am I to worship? What are my servitors? Christianity was the abstract ideology of an urban centered court hierarchy priesthood. Its organization was obsessed with political power only. It knew nothing about the land, the seasons, the crops, natural energies. If the peasants listened to the church, nothing would grow. These brilliant monks who wrote so contemptuously about superstition, let us remember, also believed that the earth was flat and at the center of the universe, and that the mother of the universe was a man who created the first female from Adam's rib. According to Cosmos, a 6th century Christian geographer, Jerusalem was at the center of the flat earth, which had been created about 4000 BC by a Hebrew thunder god. To doubt such Christian superstitions during Inquisition days meant heresy and could lead to one being burnt at the stake. We will never know what harm was done to the human psyche by these rabid terrorisms. That Christianity destroyed books, libraries, whole cultures and their records, monuments of ancient knowledge and wonderful art, that it set the intellectual development of the human race back hundreds of thousands of years. We already know. We can only begin to guess what it did to the natural poetic psyche of human beings. The dream process itself, ecstasy, divination, foretelling, entrancement, use of magic, herbs, drugs, and shamanic yogic techniques, powers essential to the evolutionary health and balance of the human psyche, were forbidden, punished, and driven into a guilt-ridden underground by Christian dogma. The witch hammer reinforced the Old Testament injunction that all dreamers must be stoned to death. A man or a woman in whom there is a pythonical or divining spirit, or that is a wizard, let them die. They shall be stoned. Leviticus 20:27. Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, and that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death. Deuteronomy 13:3-5. The Malleus Maleficarum proclaimed, those women are called pythons, in whom the devil works extraordinary things. It is unlawful for any man to practice divination, and if he does so, his reward shall be death by the sword of the executioner. The Malleus and the church denounced witchcraft as a spiritual crime. It blasphemed and profaned the Creator. Perhaps more crucial, the psychic powers tapped and activated by witches were defined as political crimes. Witchcraft is high treason against God's majesty because the state acted as police, prosecutor, judge, and executioner for the church's definition of such crime. High treason against God surely constituted a threat to its temporal power as well. Thought police and dream police are not 20th century atheistic inventions. They are our inheritance from the European Inquisition, which in the joint name of God and the King initiated the most extreme, active manipulation and politicization of the human mental processes ever known. According to Christianity, human beings may have only one dream, the dream of redemption through Christ from the sin of being born. That never ever made sense to me, y'all. Now I know why. So the entire ancient relation between the cosmos and the human mind, meditated or mediated by the dream process, was thus interfered with and distorted by patriarchal dogma. The witches were accused of riding through the night with Diana, of practicing divination, of studying the stars and observing seasons, of having knowledge of plants for medicinal and visionary purposes. In other words, they were accused of dreaming dreams and using their own mind. They were accused and found guilty of communing with the powers of the universe. and for knowing themselves to be one with that universe. Such knowledge, such communion is a major crime in any society where a biophobic father god rules. To this day, we in the enlightened West are surrounded by laws forbidding use of natural drugs like peyote and mushrooms for pythonic purposes. North American Indians, like pagan people worldwide, were punished by their conquerors for practicing peyote rituals and shamanism. As substitutes, they were handed the white man's prisons, Christianity, and alcohol. Alcohol and drugs become addictions only in cultures where ritual drug use is forbidden. Christian missionaries fight peyote. That's P-E-Y-O-T-E. I'm gonna say peyote because it sounds like coyote or peyote. Peyote and mushroom use for political reasons. They want to be in total control of human visionary experience. They want to control the contents and directions of our dreams. And where missionaries fade away, modern psychotherapists come on strong. Established mental health doctrine views all powerful messages and visions from the subconscious as the self as undesirable symptoms of mental disturbance. Too many of our modern visionaries have been inquisitioned inquisinated by straitjackets, the normalizing drugs, electroshock therapy, and lobotomies. From the torture of the Inquisition, breaking bodies on the rack in the name of saving souls, to the modern psychiatrist administering electroshock or sonic lobotomies for the purpose of adjusting the mind, there is a little difference. Both are cremators of the soul that dreams. Both, in the name of cure, are employed by a society that needs to adjust human beings to la vida sin sueños. La vida sin sueños. Here, let me see. What does this say?
La vida sin sueños.
Okay, life without dreams, that's what that means. The witch burnings didn't take place during the Dark Ages as we commonly suppose. They occurred between the 15th and the 18th centuries. All right, precisely during and following the Renaissance. That glorious period when, as we are taught, men's minds were being freed from bleakness and superstition. While Michelangelo was sculpting and Shakespeare writing, witches were burning. The whole secular enlightenment, in fact, the male professions of doctor, lawyer, judge, artist, all rose from the ashes of the destroyed women's culture. Renaissance men were celebrating naked female beauty in their art, while women's bodies were being tortured and burned by the hundreds of thousands all around them. Interesting. New communication technology was contributed to the witch hunts. The printing press was established in 1450. The first major work printed was the Bible. Martin Luther was born in 1483. We know that the Protestant Reformation of the early 16th century was fueled in large part by the existence of the new mass printing technology. The Latin Bible used by the Catholic Church was an elitist handbook. Few possessed it, fewer could read it. The Reformists argued for the translation of the Bible into German, into all the European vernaculars, so that the people could read the Word of God for themselves. This religious revolution was made possible by the new print technology. As the 16th century heated up, as we've said, witches were everywhere, caught in the crossfire between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformists. But there was another turn of the screw. In the 16th century, for the first time, people were able to read the Bible's misogyny in their own languages. Before, they'd receive only the Latin passages and the interpretations of priests. But now the full Word of God was spread before their eyes, and Yahweh's wrathful condemnation of female flesh as the unclean playing field of the devil was quite clear. Because of their fundamentalist literalism in the following of Holy Right, the misogyny of the Reformists were often more extreme, if possible, than that of the Catholics. Further, the new popular press throve on the witch hunts, etched plates depicting pornographic scenes of witches romping with satanic figures, and graphic etchings and woodcuts showing varieties of tortures, drownings, and burnings of women were printed in large numbers and broadcast through every town, large and small. Some feminists might feel these popular press images were the snuff films and penthouse magazines of their day. They purported to be on the spot depictions of tortures and burnings, with naked and half-naked female bodies screaming and writhing in endless tortures or endless postures of agony, surrounded by well-dressed male judges, religious accusers, prickers, and other righteous gentlemen of the time. There is no doubt that these mass-printed images fueled a mass paranoia against women, against witches. They also marked the beginnings in the West of pornography as popular entertainment. Interesting. It is historically chilling to consider that the new print medium, before it ever served as a tool of mass education or enlightenment, was used as a firebrand to ignite mass hysteria and murder. But this was the case. The new technology of the radio served the rising terrorist dictatorship of Adolf Hitler in the same way, and the use of the television medium by demagogic, hell-raising preachers and politicians, especially in America, might give us a frisson of forewarning. Jerry Mander, an analyst of modern electronic communications media, points out that certain media favor certain fundamentalist types of God and religious worldviews. Religions with charismatic leaders, single, all-powerful God, or individual godlike figures are simpler to handle on television because they have highly defined characteristics. Nature-based religions are dependent upon a gaslight of human feelings and perpetual exchanges with the planet, and would lose their meaning on television. Devil projection and witch hunting are functional parts of patriarchy. They are essential tools of mass control via mass energy diversion. If life is born out of evil, as Christians believe, then devil paranoia is chronic to Christian life. If we look at Western Christian history through our pagan evolutionary glasses, we can see that demon projection and witch hunting have never really stopped. They are endemic to Western politics. One reason the Inquisition and witch burnings died down in Europe was that Christian European kings, governments, religious men, and male citizens had found new hunting grounds, new scapegoats. A round world had given them new worlds to conquer, with new heathens to convert, use, and destroy. Europe emerged from the Inquisition of its own peoples via the Inquisition of the Dark Others across the oceans, i.e., imperialist colonism. There were black Africans to be enslaved on their own continent or dragged in chains to the American colonies, where there were also numerous indigenous tribes of pagan idolaters, the North, Central, and South American Indians, all of whom could be defined as mere animals, bestial demons, and spawn of the devil, whatever it took to rationalize enslaving them, massacring them, ripping off and cannibalizing their lands, cultures, and life energies. Whenever we read the history of Western colonial imperialism during the 15th and 19th centuries, we should remember that the men, the political and religious institutions and worldviews conducting it were the same as those who conducted the Christian Inquisition and witch hunts for 5 solidly sadistic centuries. Christian men, in the name of Christ, enlarging their properties, their powers, and their pieties in the same bite. Witch hunting and devil projecting, in more or less subtle forms, are classic patriarchal tools. They can be picked up and used anytime, anywhere to build the house of God, that exclusive clubhouse of ambitious men. In the past decade in America and throughout the world, there has been a resurgence of fundamentalist religious activity, or at least an increased focus on it in the media. Fundamentalism in any Western religion, Christian, Judaic, Muslim, means a strict literalist interpretation of and obedience to the words of some ancient text or texts considered divinely inspired, coupled with a zealous desire to make the world correspond to these texts, i.e., God's Word, God's law. In the mid-1970s poll taken by one of the popular presses, 50% of the Americans interviewed agreed with the statement that all the world's troubles were caused by the devil. And in 1980, Americans installed a president who, in public statements, seems to be stating his belief that half the world, the other half, is composed of beings who intentionally will evil. With this upsurge of fundamentalist ontology has come increased media reports of satanic cults and sensationalized television dramas of such cults and related ritual killings in America. Undoubtedly, there are satanic cults in the United States composed of both silly and dangerous people, but it must be pointed out that there is no historic records of mass killings by Satanists anywhere at any time. The world record for mass killings is held by Christians. Hundreds of millions of human beings in the past 2,000 years have been tortured and slaughtered in an infinite number of hideous ways in the name of Christ and by people who believed or who said they believed they were exterminating agents of the devil, Satan worshippers, dangerous idolaters. We have just talked about the first Holocaust, 300 years of witch burning in Europe, and the second Holocaust of World War II. 5 million to 6 million Jews were exterminated, along with millions of other unclean subhumans, end quotes, okay? Communists, feminists, gypsies, homosexuals, the physically and mentally handicapped in Germany, Austria, France. Altogether, about 45 million people died in that war, including 22 million Russians and all the Japanese citizens who perished in the nuclear holocaust of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II had several causes and secular triggers, but essentially it was one more religious war. Adolf Hitler was born and bred a German Catholic in 1941. He stated to one of his generals, Gerhard Engel, I am now as before a Catholic and will always remain so. In Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly states his conviction that he is working for God and Christ. Therefore, I am convinced that I am acting as the agent of our Creator. By fighting off the Jews, I am doing the Lord's work. At a Nazi Christian celebration in 1926, Hitler proclaimed Christ was the greatest early fighter in the battle against the world enemy, the Jews. The work that Christ started but could not finish, I, Adolf Hitler, will conclude. Quote, okay, end quote. So Hitler's program was essentially a fundamentalist program. He was extremely moralistic, violently opposing adultery, any kind of sexual liberation for women, or any roles for women outside of wife, mother, and church volunteer. He opposed abortion, though this did not keep him from killing children and pregnant women or from allowing women's wombs to be packed with cement and laboratory experiments. And he opposed pornography, though this did not prevent him from creating the obscenities of Auschwitz or Dachau. The point is that historically it has never been satanic cults or devil worshippers, even when such groups exist, that have endangered the world on any large scale. The world has been endangered and ravaged in historic times and is endangered now overwhelmingly by righteous, in quotes, fundamentalist, moralistic people who insist they are working for God, for Christ, doing the Lord's work, and who manage to get large numbers of people to agree with them. In particular, armed men. The mechanism of all holy war is devil projection, the targeting of specific groups, heretics, witches, Jews, communists, feminists, homosexuals, subversives, or demonic satanic agents, and the inflammatory insistence that God wills the exorcism or extermination of these devils by his chosen, i.e. self-appointed, holy men. Years or centuries of conflagration follow the historic damage in the West, being done not by devil worshippers, but by Christians ruled by their fear and hatred of the devil. We do not know how many people have died recently in America at the hands of satanic cults. In the past decade, there have been dozens of killings by Christians of other human beings believed to be possessed by the devil. Tragically, with few exceptions, the victims have all been little children, tortured and killed by their parents, relatives, or babysitters because this pitiful, Bible-obsessed adults believed the children had the devil in them. Doubtless the mid-1970s success of films like The Exorcist and The Omen, in which the devil always sensationally picks children to inhabit, is related to this sad phenomenon. In 1976, a Christian fundamentalist sect was involved in the beating death of a 3-year-old boy whose parents were members of the sect. They were beating the devil out of the boy. In Philadelphia in 1979, a 3-month-old baby was thrown out of a second-story window by its aunt because she said, "The Lord told me to." In New York in 1980, a 21-month-old boy was exorcised by his mother while 3 brothers watched. The infant was scalded in boiling water and then seared to death in an oven. The mother explained to the police that she had to get the devil out of her baby. In 1983, a 2.5-year-old California girl was held down by her father on a hot floor heater until the devil left her and she died. In 1984, in Bangor, Maine, a man killed his girlfriend's 4-year-old daughter by burning her in an electric oven. He claimed the child was Lucifer, and he was performing an exorcism on her. In Austin, Texas, in 1980, a 21-year-old male was sleeping with his head against his truck window one night when his best friend drove up, saw his head, and blew his brains out with a deer rifle. The man with the gun had just been discussing Satan with his female companion, and he told police he had seen the devil in his sleeping friend's head. In Hampton, Virginia, in 1979, a mother cut off her own hand, the right hand of her 5-year-old daughter, and the left hand of her 7-month-old daughter because she had been reading the Bible and thinking about John the Baptist being beheaded. In a small Wisconsin town in February 1985, a man called himself Elijah shot and killed a priest and 2 church parishioners. He claimed he was following God's will and punishing these men for allowing a girl to read scriptures during Mass. In American Fork, Utah, in the winter of 1984, 2 brothers named Ron and Dan Lafferty entered by force the home of their sister-in-law, Brenda, the wife of a younger brother, Alan Lafferty. The 2 brothers were founders of the Church of Prophets, a breakaway fundamentalist Mormon sect. A few years earlier, they had been excommunicated by the Mormon Church for their behavior and beliefs, which included a return to polygamy as a holy duty. The Church of Prophets, citing Bible texts as support, claimed that wives were property given to men by God and meant to obey without question all instructions from their husbands. A woman who resisted her husband's wishes in any matter was a fornicator. And her children were, in the eyes of God and the Utah prophets, children of fornication. Brenda Lafferty has supported the wives of these 2 brothers in divorce suits following the men's return to holy polygamy. Ron and Dan Lafferty had also received a revelation that called for 6 mighty ones to battle for the Lord against Lucifer. The school of prophets were born in this revelation, composed of 5 Lafferty brothers, but the 6th, Alan, was discouraged by his wife from having anything to do with the self-appointed prophets. She believed they were Satanists. When the Lafferty brothers forced their way into Brenda's home while her husband was at work, they were acting according to another revelation. God had told them that it was His will that these people be removed. Witnesses heard the men calling Brenda a bitch, slut, and liar. She fought back, kicked and screamed, and begged them not to harm her child, who was in a crib. The 2 men stifled her with a pillow and tied a cord around her neck so that one brother could slit her throat. Then they held her head back to let the blood pour from her body as a proper biblical sacrifice. The murder knife was then handed to Dan Lafferty, who went to the crib where a 15-month-old baby girl, Erica, was crying, "Mommy, Mommy." Dan Lafferty slit the baby's throat, telling people later, "It wasn't no problem. I felt the spirit. It was me." During this trial, Dan Lafferty acted as his own lawyer, admitted the killings freely, and defended himself entirely on the basis that the murders had been commanded by God. The state had failed to prove that a crime had been committed. He told his jury, "I could very well be fulfillment of revelation of God, not a crime. It could very well be a fulfillment of revelation of God." Lafferty further testified. And so Lafferty testified, okay, consistent with the scripture, we are told that there are going to be some frightful circumstances when the Lord's kingdom is built up and the adversary's kingdom must be torn down. We are told that will be a dreadful day. The proud will be destroyed and their children will be dashed before their eyes, and there will be no pity for the infant or the suckling. I don't intend to make excuses over things I have no control of. I'm not really sorry. I'm not in the position I am because I chose to be. We are involved in a day when the Lord has strange work to do. This is what he said. This is what he testified to. So a Utah jury sentenced Dan Lafferty and his brother Ron to life imprisonment, but they were not able to refute the Lafferty's brothers' assertions that the Holy Bible supported their deeds. These are just a few news stories emerging from the past decade in America. This book was written was published in 1987, I think. Okay, so these are just a few news stories emerging from the past decade in America. All the murders and mutilations described were performed by people who saw themselves as holy men and handmaidens of the biblical God and of Christ the Lord. They were all doing God's will, smiting devils, smiting whores and fornicators and children of fornicators. The full history of such holy murders in the West under Christianity and the influence of the biblical Old Testament would be much longer than this account, and even more nauseating. The devil is the curse of those who have abandoned the goddess. Finally, a word about Satanism, which has nothing to do with witchcraft. Witchcraft, we should know by now, is the ancient European pagan religion going back to the hunting times and the Paleolithic caves. Its practitioners worship a female goddess and her consort, the Horned One, who was represented with the goat hoovers and horns of the god Pan, meaning all. The fertility spirit of nature. Pan goes back to this shamanic figure in the Trois Frères cave, the sorcerer dancing in animal mask and skins. This figure was interpreted by Christians as the devil, amalgamated with their concepts of the evil principle. But Pan represented life and life energy, not evil. The witches never worshipped evil, which is a Christian obsession. They worshipped as human beings worshipped at the beginning of time. Okay, the goddess, her nature, her fertility, and her cyclic life and death cosmos. Satanism is a Christian heresy. You can't believe in a Satan unless you also believe in Christian ontology and the Bible. Satanism is of a very recent origin. The first Black Mass, conducted as a parody of the Catholic Mass, was performed in the late 17th century at the court of Louis XV. He was performed by 50 to 60 Roman Catholic, maybe the 14th. Yeah, that's a 4. Louis XIV. So it was performed by 50 to 60 Roman Catholic priests hired by the king, who conducted mass on a naked girl's belly as an amatory lark to amuse the court. The satanic Black Mass dedicated to Antichrist and designed to worship and invoke the principle of evil does not appear in history until the 19th century. It was basically a literary invention and an amusement of decadent aristocrats and artists. And from this comes our idea of Satanism. Thank you for joining me, liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell. Y'all stay blessed and ready for the next one. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.